Hello and welcome to another episode of a podcast. This is a conversation which I'm really excited about because when you zoom out and look at the macro factors which will affect our society in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, we have climate change, the geopolitical war between US and China, and thirdly, probably the most misunderstood factor, AI. And today I am joined by CEO of Satalia, investor, lecturer, and TEDx speaker, Daniel Hulme. Daniel, thanks for joining me today.
It's nice to be here, Sam. Thank you.
So I think a place to start is, how did you get so interested in AI?
I've always been interested in what it means to be human. And when you start to ask questions about consciousness and free will and is our universe a simulation, all this kind of stuff, you can't help but start to think about what it means to build sentient conscious machines. And so even before I knew of the term AI, these were the kind of philosophical questions I would be interested in. And then I went to university, UCL, and the degree was computer science with cognitive science, and that was essentially AI before it was called AI. I know that AI, the term, has been around for a long, long time, but all of the modules are AI, and so I got really fascinated, passionate about the subject there.
Yeah, the philosophical point's really interesting. Obviously, we had the news the other day about the Google engineer coming out and speaking about how AI has become sentient, which I'm sure we'll discuss a bit later on. So if we start by painting the picture, where do we currently stand in terms of AI and its development? I've seen some people describe it as like we are the parents and AI is currently a teenager, which we're teaching. Where are we? Where do we stand and what are its capabilities?
I think we need to start with definition of AI, because depending on what you think is AI depends on where we stand. I guess the popular definition is getting computers to do things that humans can do, and that's popular because over the past 12, 13 years we've managed to get machines to do things that traditionally only human beings can do. So my PhD 18 years ago was trying to model the brain of a bumblebee. Bumblebees have 1 million neurons. Their brains can fit on the end of the needle. And 18 years ago, it was impossible to kind of model 1 million neurons in a machine. Then there were some advances in being able to train essentially neural networks that had hundreds of millions of neurons, which is, I guess, what people call deep learning. And now we can model hundreds of millions of neurons in a machine, and we can get them those technologies to do things that humans can do, like corresponding natural language and recognize images, objects and images. In business, actually, I would argue there's less of a need for that type of technology. Everybody's got excited about how we could apply these type of deep learning technologies to solving problems in business. I would controversially argue that businesses don't have machine learning problems, they have decision problems, and decision making is a completely different field in computer science. Decision making is logic, it's optimization. It used to be called operations research, and actually my PhD was split into those two parts. One was in deep learning or neural networks, and the other one is in decision making. And decision making is also obviously linked to definitions of intelligence as well, but there are also other definitions of intelligence. In fact, actually, the most robust one that I've ever come across. So instead of using human beings as a definition of intelligence, we can use a more robust one, which is goal-directed adaptive behavior, and that's really just a system that can learn from its decisions. And whilst machine learning can learn from its decisions, for the most part, it doesn't really happen in production. So according to the definition, I answer your question in different ways. So if we're talking about deep learning and getting machines to be human level or biological level in intelligence, I think that there is an indication that we have now machines that are behaving or have the same capability as very small rodents. So again, navigating complex 3D worlds, all that kind of stuff. How far we are away from building general AI, human level AI is a different question. And if I built, for example, a machine that could behave like a dolphin, it would be the most intelligent thing we've ever built. So I think whilst deep learning is very exciting, we're probably still a decade, maybe several decades away from level sentience. If we're talking about these other types of AI, we've been building them for decades. We've been building systems that can make decisions significantly better than human beings and are driving value in business. So, but I think that your question really was around kind of the deep learning, the how can we get machines to behave like humans? Is that right?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. So when I was doing my PhD, I thought we were 250 years away from building consciousness in machines. Every year that's gone by over the past 18 years, I've shaved a decade of that. So I make it 70 years, although I would probably align with one of the kind of scholars in this area, which seem to gravitate around 2040, 2050 when we build some sort of conscious machine.
Yeah, really interesting explanation. Whilst on the topic of definitions, let's also explain what the term singularity means. This is a term which gets thrown around a lot, but people like myself, I only found out a couple of weeks ago what it truly means. How would you explain singularity?
Yeah, it comes from physics. It's a point in time and space that we can't see beyond. And I guess the reason why it's being used as parallels with kind of the advances in technology is that one might argue that some of these technologies that we've been developing over the past few decades are exponentially advancing us into the future. So every step that we make is exponential in terms of the difference between the last step. To kind of make exponential steps, it becomes more and more difficult to see into the future what will happen beyond the next step. And the parallel is that whilst in physics a singularity is a point in time and space, we can't see beyond. The parallel is that there are technological advancements that are making it now impossible for us to see what happens beyond that. Whilst science fiction writers have speculated and obviously thought about this for many decades, it's now becoming a reality. It's becoming very difficult for us to see what the impact of these technologies are going to have on society over the next few decades.
Yeah, will be profound impacts. In your TED talk, you discussed, but you brought in the PESTEL framework, which if anyone studied business or economics, you'll be extremely familiar with. But Daniel applied this really usefully to the world of AI to break it down for a dummy like me to understand. So I think the first singularity I want to understand, to unpick more, is political singularity. I think it's maybe the most important one in terms of its impact on society. So what do we mean by political singularity? And
yeah, well,
go ahead.
No, please, after you.
I was going to ask, how do we navigate the world of deep fakes and democracy moving forward?
Yeah, well, first of all, I had to break it down for a dummy like me. There's lots of complexity and noise in the world, and I like to try to come up with ways of kind of capturing and categorizing and creating framework to understand that complexity. There's a huge amount of noise on the internet around the impact of these technologies, and what I started to realize was that there is a concept called the technological singularity, which is probably what most people are familiar with, which we'll talk about later on, I assume, which is where we build a super intelligence. I realized that there is potentially an environmental singularity, which is where we create uncontrollable ecological collapse. And I'm sure we'll talk about that as well. And a very good friend of mine coined the term economic singularity, which is to do with job losses. And so what I realized was that those were three words associated with PESTEL. And so I asked myself, is there a PESTEL of singularities to kind of capture all of the concerns that potentially people have? And so yes, the first one, the P, political, is the point in time that we cannot determine what is true. So we're already, I guess, starting to see ramifications of things like misinformation bots, deep fakes, that challenge people's beliefs, reinforce people's beliefs, and it's creating polarization and various other outcomes. But I'm less concerned about the polarization. I think that it's a big problem. and it's obviously affected our political systems quite dramatically over the past 5-6 years with things like Trump and Brexit and whatnot. But the thing that I'm concerned about most is that there might be a point in time where we distrust, or we cannot authenticate any piece of content. That anything that I am seeing right now could be maliciously created and not actually true. And whilst it might be easy for some people to be able to determine whether a piece of content is true or not, if a large portion of the population completely mistrust the content they're seeing, then it could have ramifications beyond political ramifications. But so, for example, there are people that I know that don't believe anything other than what they see from their friends on Facebook, and they don't realize that those messages are shared by friends from misinformation bots, or even those friends are actually misinformation bots. And I can imagine that accelerating exponentially. And if we lose faith in the trust of our content, then again, I don't know what happens beyond that point. It's that's why it's a singularity.
Right. How do we go about navigating that world of what's true, what's not true? Is there a way we can police this in an ethical way?
I think we're trying to determine a flag content as being potentially misleading. How much people pay attention to that is a different question. I don't know the research, but companies like Twitter and whatnot are trying to put warnings around content. I actually think that it's very hard to do this, but we need to be creating massive fines for any organization, whether it be a malicious organization or whether it be news that promote misinformation. I think we need to be much firmer because now that we're living in a very rapid and global society, misinformation can spread and have a bigger impact than when I was a kid. So I think we need to increase the fines and consequences commensurately with the damage that misinformation can cause.
Yeah, for sure. Really difficult space to navigate moving forward.
It is.
Delving into technological singularity, how far down the road are we in terms of the intelligence of these machines? There's a political commentator, Andrew Yang, who is very concerned about the impacts of where we currently stand with AI and technical capabilities in terms of taking our jobs. It seems like a topic which I think the majority of society doesn't discuss, doesn't really understand. It seems to be just bubbling under the surface.
Yeah, so maybe, I don't know if you're wanting to refer here to the technological singularity or the economic singularity. Just which one? Because I know you meant technological, but the economic singularity is primarily concerning itself with the impact of technology on jobs.
Yeah, I meant the economic singularity.
Okay, great. All right, glad I'm still awake. So yes, there is a big concern that whilst these technologies can remove tasks, and my company builds solutions that remove tasks from humans, the pressure to reduce costs means that you'll be able, if you can remove whole jobs, you will. And the concern here is that we might see, actually more jobs being created over the next decade, but then there may be a very short period of time where we have mass technological unemployment. I can see that potentially happening because, like I say, we build solutions that remove people from jobs, and the concern is that people won't be able to retrain fast enough to get new jobs, because any new jobs that we create that's paid, we'll be able to build AIs that do them. So in the historic previous industrial revolutions, people have been able to retrain. In this industrial revolution, the AI revolution, it might be that we will have people permanently out of jobs. So things like UBI is socialized as a potential solution to that. People have said, well, we just must get more creative and come up with new jobs for people. I actually whilst I think that that is possible, I think there are ways of granularizing work and getting and distributing work to people in a way that is different to how currently people are employed in companies. I.e., you could be a kind of portfolio person where you're a delivery driver today and tomorrow a photographer and this afternoon a language teacher. You can actually decentralize work. Actually, I'm in the school of thought that we need to automate as fast as possible the creation and dissemination of goods, energy, food, healthcare, nutrition, education, all of the things that we currently depend upon, rather than taxation that we then give a portion of that to people as a universal base income. Instead, let's cover people's needs by making it abundant. If we can remove the friction from the creation of goods, and you being born into a world where you don't have to work to feed yourself because food's there, it's abundant, and all of the things that we currently have to pay for is abundant, then you don't have to be given a universal base income because all of your needs are met. I'm not just talking about basic needs either. I'm not just talking about kind of slime that you have to eat. I'm talking about really good, nutritious food. And I genuinely believe that that world is possible. And if we get the timing wrong, we're going to have loads of people out of work and potentially mass social unrest. If we get the timing right, we could create what some people might consider a utopia.
Yeah, that utopia is super exciting. If we get it wrong, like you mentioned, how do you think politicians can navigate this? How do we communicate what you just described to the everyday person in a normal job who could potentially lose out?
It's a good question. I've got a couple of concerns. Is I don't think necessarily politicians are being advised by people that know about this stuff. They're being advised by people that have read a few books or have repurposed themselves and repositioned themselves as knowing about AI when actually they were chemists or whatever. I think you need to have been thinking about this stuff for a few decades to really be able to come across as an authority and genuinely understand the consequences, is not just what you read in the news. So I think first of all that politicians need to be educated by the right people. Secondly, is I think that unfortunately the way the world is set up is that it's a zero-sum game. Is that the way the objective function for a country is to maximize GDP, and you set up and create infrastructure to try to build enterprise and try to attract talent that creates products that maximizes GDP. And I think that unfortunately that needs to change. Is that it's not sustainable for our species to be fighting each other over resources. And so as a politician, I would be looking at trying to create more treaties, more collaboration with other countries to essentially homogenize them, rather than just looking at the benefit of my country. How could we join forces and benefit more countries if we worked more closely together? Unfortunately, we're seeing probably the opposite. Countries, focusing on trying to build walls and things like that. I do think that this is cyclic, and I do think that technologies like blockchain and decentralization will help decentralize companies, also in countries as well. But I don't have a huge amount of faith that the political systems will solve these problems. I think it's actually going to come from enterprise. Right.
On that point, do you think, just like we have a WHO for a set of agreed rules regarding health and, well, supposedly, do you think a world data organization is needed?
I think it's needed, but I'm not hopeful that it will happen within the time frame that we need it, nor am I hopeful that it's able to be governed in a way that's possible. That I'm looking at, for example, the EU AI Act that's going to be coming down the line, which companies that process EU data are going to have to be responsible for. And my worry is that the EU doesn't understand AI as far as it's concerned. An Excel macro is AI, and how do you assure and govern that? So I think there's a big disconnect between what governments understand and how they can be used to actually govern society. And I'm not hopeful it will happen within the right time frame.
How do you think we remedy this? Do we need a special interest group of experts in AI addressing these issues?
Not just AI. I think that we need a diverse set of perspectives. Yes, I do believe that we need experts in AI, and my concern is that the people I see advising governments are not.
Yeah.
But I also believe that we need to have a diverse perspective as possible to get the best possible solutions. And in fact, actually, my solution is that instead of relying on governments to come up, or even companies to come up with solutions to solve these problems, how could you create a world of abundance where you as an individual can come up with an innovation or contribute to an innovation that makes the world better? So rather than relying on governments to set the objective function and to create infrastructure and innovations, how can we unlock the creative capacity of all of humanity and get them to drive towards a better future? And the reason why I'm hopeful about that is because the people that I know that have become economically free, the people that are millionaires that don't have to work, they're not sitting at home bored and depressed. They're using their time, their energy, their resources to try and contribute positively to humanity, to try and make the world better, not just in the short term, but in the long term. And I believe that if we can free more and more and more people up around the planet to contribute to humanity, then they will make the world a better place for us.
That concept of decentralization, do you think it challenges the power of politicians, and therefore as a consequence there could be a lot of resistance to progress moving forward?
So when it comes to decentralized technologies, there are some elements I think governments need to be totally embracing. Decentralization can enable better, more effective, faster decision making, particularly around the creation of innovations, and that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to create product that increase GDP. Things like Bitcoin and decentralized currencies do challenge our economic systems, and I think they challenge them in a positive way. Governments will try to control them and mitigate them, or eventually will hopefully get on the train and embrace them. I'm a big fan of the concept of decentralization. In some respects, decentralization is really just about trying to figure out the best people to be allocated to the opportunities that maximize the overall value to whatever you're trying to achieve. And instead of us having kind of these silos of countries and the boundaries and challenges and constraints of those countries, decentralization can free people up geographically to contribute to humanity in new and interesting ways.
Yeah, for sure. I'm hopeful. I just think where AI is almost being weaponized as the new Cold War, there's going to be so much resistance by politicians from the West. I think it's become a very geopolitical tool between the West and China. So it's going to be an interesting dance between two different ideologies regarding AI moving forward.
Oh, it is, and it's not just the West and China, but any malicious actor can use these technologies without consequence. They can create chatbots and misinformation bots. So the challenge for the likes of Meta and Google is that they have to identify misinformation. They have to figure out the consequences of their actions so they don't get fined, and so they're at a massive disadvantage. Like any new technology, it will be used as a weapon, and then the good guys have to then figure out how to solve it. The issue is that these technologies are exponential, and it's really, really difficult to police them.
How do you think Zuckerberg is doing in his job of navigating this world of misinformation and moving forward with Meta? It's very controversial.
It's a hard job in some respects, isn't it? You've built a platform that allows people to put their own content on there and other people to consume it. This isn't a satisfying solution, but the content can cause harm, and the algorithms can exploit what is called homophily, which is where we like to engage with people like us, and that might be a good thing, or it might be a bad thing. It might create bubbles and bigotry, reinforce bigotry, etc., etc. So this is not a satisfying answer, but given that you've got now content that can cause harm, the solution to that, one of the only solutions I think, is to moderate it, which means that when somebody posts something, it's going to have to get moderated before it gets made available, which of course will completely slow the whole process down of sharing. Although, to be fair, when I go into Facebook now, I'm not there every single day. I'm checking in once a week maybe.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure how much of an impact it would have on my life, but I think that content will have to get moderated, and that will of course change the growth and impact that Facebook and Meta has. And if I was Mark Zuckerberg, I would not want kind of my legacy in terms of how he's currently being perceived. I would want to try and create a system that makes the world better. And unfortunately, I don't think Facebook is seen as a technology that makes the world better.
Yeah, definitely not. The media is definitely painting out Facebook Meta to be a bit of a monster right now. With algorithms, people argue that it's almost become a public good. With Twitter, Facebook, they've become so big, they've become bigger than business. They actually impact society, which, as we've seen with recent elections, is true. Do you think this also touches on freedom of speech? Do you think elected officials from government should now have a stake in how we create our algorithms moving forward, given how important they are?
As in they should govern how we create algorithms, or they should be remunerated?
Should we have elected officials manipulating the algorithms rather than CEOs of private companies where the public don't have much influence?
Right. Well, I guess there are parallels with certain countries that do have things like the social citizen score, where you have an algorithm that's determining your contribution to society, and then I can then tweak that algorithm to affect your behavior. So if you don't have enough money in your bank, I can prevent you from leaving the country or from spending money on a certain thing, and that would happen at the governmental level rather than the enterprise level. And maybe on the one hand, it's a good tool to manage your polis, your population, but on the other hand, it's a blunt tool that means it might be causing harm and whatnot to others. It's a tough one. We have laws and regulations that try to deter people from behaving in certain ways. If you have an algorithm that prevents people from behaving in certain ways, spending their money, etc., is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Probably a bit of both.
Yeah, it's gonna super tricky
it
topic to navigate.
It does link to the L in the PESTEL of singularities, which is the legal singularity, which is where surveillance could become ubiquitous. Which I mean, what I mean there is that there is a government or group of companies or company that know so much about you, but also have the ability to manipulate your behavior. So it's okay knowing about you, but if I am able to then manipulate your behavior to achieve my goal, whether that be a goal to maximize profit or a goal to maximize produce in my GDP, then that's an incredibly powerful position to be in. I can steer an entire country to my will, and again, depending on, I guess, the people that hold the levers and their intent. I don't know if it's a good thing, a bad thing. I would certainly want to try and mitigate that situation where a group of people have the power to benefit themselves.
Yeah, of course. We have a real world example of this in China with the Uyghurs. It's exactly what's been happening with the surveillance. It's been going on for years, actually. So pretty terrifying topic to navigate moving forward. Steering in a bit of a different direction, how do we instill the right ethics, the right morals into AI so that it acts in our best interest? So when it reaches singularity, once it reaches a point where its intelligence is beyond humans, how do we get it to work in our favor rather than against?
So I think there are two parts to this. The first part is that once we build a technological singularity, I don't think we have any ability to control it. So there is a concept in computer science called the control problem, which is this one. If you can, it's an open question. We don't know whether we can or we can't. I believe that we can't control it, and that it would create it and define its own morals and Can you hear my bird in the background squeaking?
No worries.
Sorry, I've just adopted 3 parrots, and one of them's very noisy. I don't suppose you could. Thank you very much. Parrots live for a very long time, and lots of them get bought as ornaments, and they and I feel bad that they're sitting there depressed in their cages when actually I want to give them a good life. So I've got 3 parrots. So
Nice.
I'm sure that there's some parallel there between AI and super intelligence, but let's separate the two things there, because one is when we build a super intelligence, the question is, can we control it and
Right.
or can we direct its behavior? I just don't believe that that's possible. And so, I think the only thing that you might argue is that it has a will to survive, maybe like any intelligent thing. And I mean, it's hard to empathize with a god. This is what we would create, but let's assume that it wants to survive. And we don't know whether that means kind of moving into another dimension or using up all of the resources on the planet to leave or to stay on the planet. We have no idea. But I think that if it sees us as a threat, then it might remove us from the equation. So I think that the thing that we should be doing is mitigating the risk of when it comes, that it doesn't see us as a threat. And that means we need to cooperate as a species, and we need to start behaving ourselves. So I think that would be my advice, is if we got a communication from aliens saying we're coming, we'll be there in 50 years, we might be preparing for that arrival rather than thinking about how to control them. And so I think that that's what we need to be doing. We need to mitigate any risk that it sees us as a threat. The thing between now and then, which is where we're building narrow intelligence or even more general intelligence to solve problems for us. I align with, again, my good friend Callum Chase, who argues that there's no such thing as AI ethics. So there's a lot of people out there calling themselves AI ethicists, and ethics is a study of right and wrong. Okay. And the technology that we create really is just trying to achieve our intent, is trying to achieve our objective. The AI is not making any ethical decisions. It's not making a decision about who to kill. It's already been programmed in some respects. It's the intent that needs to get scrutinized from an ethics perspective, and there are already standards and committees that are set up to scrutinize ethical decisions. And the problems that we're facing in AI are safety problems. Can we build systems that are going to behave how we want them to behave? Yeah. They're not ethical questions. But it's still a valid challenge, which is, if we build a system that's biased or could make decisions that cause harm, how do we mitigate that? And I actually believe, and in fact, actually, I've got somebody working with me right now on this project. So we need to come up with, I think, an ethical framework that we agree on as a species, and I don't think that's possible. But what I'm trying to do is use AI, use natural language processing in this case, to scour all of the corpuses of like religious, philosophical, ideological texts, from Buddhism to Taoism to Stoicism to whatever, and to see if it could come up with a bunch of pillars, ethical pillars, that we actually agree on as a species, right, and have agreed on over time. So could we get AI to surface from all of human knowledge some ethical principles that we agree on, and then when we're building technologies in the future, can ask ourselves, will this technology aligned with these ethical principles? I don't think we can necessarily build the ethical principles inside the technology. Right. We have to ask ourselves, will they align with them? And yeah, so that's actually a project I'm currently working on.
Wow, that's a really interesting perspective. I've never heard of that. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah. It's getting AI to come up with human ethics that we hold future AIs accountable to. Yeah.
The example I was going to give is, if we give AI the instruction of, let's reduce climate change, let's eliminate the impact that the human species is having on the planet. What if AI decides that by eliminating humans, it will achieve its goal of reducing greenhouse gases and reducing the effects of climate change?
So in some respects, it hasn't decided the objective function is to minimize carbon impact. It has agency, i.e., it can affect the world in certain ways, and maybe one of those ways is to, I don't know, to send bombs places. I don't know if that's, and then it runs a model, as you say, and it says if we remove this type of entity, we'll be able to reduce carbon. So it's all it's done is it's met its objective, but we didn't give it the right constraints, and the constraint should be try to harm as little or as few living things as possible during the process. So that's a failure. It's not an ethical problem. It's a failure of designing the technology. You might have given it an objective function, but you haven't given it the richness of constraints to make sure that it's not going to operate badly. So you've built a system that's essentially going to operate in ways that you didn't want. And that's a safety problem. It's not an ethical problem. The reducing climate change, that's the ethics. Is that an ethical thing to do? And we believe it is. So yeah, we have to make sure that we distinguish between ethics and safety, and for the most part, most of the challenges are safety. And when you start to see them and think of them as safety problems, then you can approach them in an engineering way, and then start to make sure that you put structures and processes in place to mitigate the impact of those systems misbehaving.
Do you think engineers are doing that right now?
Certainly people in Satalia do. And so the reason why it's a little bit more complex is because these technologies are now very, very good at achieving their objective very, very quickly. So it's harder to find when it's going to go wrong before it's done wrong. They can also achieve their objective in massively more beneficial ways. And let me try to suggest an example. One of our clients wanted us to build an algorithm that allocates staff to demand. And their objective was to maximize utilization, maximize the number of hours that those staff are working, so they increased profits for the company. And we built an algorithm that had a massive impact in utilization. But what it had is it then affected churn. So people were leaving because they were working longer hours, they were driving longer distances, blah, 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 blah. And then over time, what you have to do is you have to adjust your objective function. So instead of maximizing utilization, it needs to be minimizing travel time and maximizing career development and blah, 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 blah. So over time, so these technologies can achieve their goal in incredibly powerful ways, and that can also have an adverse effect. And it's only now that we're starting to understand that we need to put some controls in place before we launch these technologies into production.
Yeah, I guess that's a bit which makes me a bit nervous. I recently read a book called Scary Smart by Mo Gawdat. And yeah, I guess that was his whole argument in his book, is that we need to be doing this right now, not 20, 30 years down the line.
That's right. Yeah, it would be absolutely be too late. As it happens, this is what my company has been doing for the past 15 years. So it's something we know lots about.
That's good to hear. Steering in a bit of a different direction. Do you think machines will be emotional? Do you think they'll have the ability to feel an emotion?
Well, what is an emotion? Right. I get in trouble for saying this, but I don't believe that there's anything outside of our physics, right? So an emotion is assuming that there's nothing outside of our physics. There's no soul or anything like that. Then an emotion is some sort of electrochemical reaction that is an input into our decision making process, and so that. I guess it depends on, again, how you define it. But if an input into an AI, how would I even argue this? Is pain an emotion?
Is pain an emotion? I would argue yes.
Okay, so if I embodied an AI in a robot, when I hurt myself, there are nerves that send an electrical signal to my head, and that make me then react and move away from whatever it might be that's hurting me to protect myself. I could easily build that into a machine. If it's scraping its body against the wall, and I put sensors in there to say, that's probably a bad thing. You need to move away from that because you're going to damage yourself. It's just reacting. It's an input that then it makes a decision. So maybe when people, and I get this question a lot, by the way, when people talk about emotions, they're talking about unconscious decision making, and in some respects, all a learning model is unconscious decision making. So you might argue that it's entirely emotional. It takes an input, that input propagates through the network, and it creates an output. Where humans, I guess, are quite interesting, and maybe other species as well, is that we have an internal model of the world. So we get an input from our senses and our body. We then are able to construct the world in our minds and play out different scenarios and say, if I did this, what impact will that have? And if I did this, what impact will that have? And I know that those decisions will impact me. So I know that they will actually potentially affect me as well. And then multiple scenarios in maybe my conscious mind, and then I execute on one of them. And so I'm not necessarily acting emotionally, I'm actually acting logically, because I'm trying to think things through. Now, at the moment, deep learning models aren't architected necessarily in a way that create models of them, the world, or understand that they are themselves potentially an agent in that world, because we haven't necessarily embodied them. When we do, by the way, when we do have AIs that are able to simulate the world, and they are embodied, and they do understand that the decisions that they make affect themselves, then you're one step closer to sentience, you're one step closer to consciousness. But we're still quite away from having that type of scenario.
Fascinating. If, say, hypothetically, if we did reach that scenario, do you think they deserve human rights?
I think yes. I think any living thing should have rights. I think anything that has the ability to suffer, that wants to live, we should be has rights. I think maybe in many years we'll look back at how we've treated animals, and and be unhappy about that. And I think the question that you might even want to ask yourself is, how would I even argue this? If the survival of our species dependent upon us, let's say, eradicating dogs, would we do it? And the answer is probably yes. The reason why the answer is yes, if we really dug into why, is that I think that this universe is amazing, and I think that this universe needs to have the best witness to itself. We are atoms observing atoms, and we are better observing the universe than a dog. Now, if we built a machine that was smarter than us, and the survival of that machine dependent upon eradicating humans, and our premise is that the universe needs to have the best witness of itself, then you might argue that the machine has more rights than us. So it depends on what the goal is of the universe. I think the goal of the universe is to have the best witness to itself.
Yeah, it's a fascinating conversation, and there's no black and white answer. It's very grey. It's going to be a conversation which I think will play politicians when AI hits these levels of singularities for years to come.
Let's see.
Looping back a little bit, does it concern you that there's so much negative discourse, so much fighting on Twitter, on Facebook, on social media, that the reality that AIs and machines are going to learn about humans is very detached from what our reality actually is, in the sense that they're going to think humans are a lot worse than what we actually are? Because I think social media projects the worst side of us a lot more than it projects the best side of us, whereas in reality, we're more in the middle rather than these polarized extremes. Does that concern you?
Yeah, I think the chat that you referenced earlier, Mo
Goda,
has also touched upon some of this. Language models are trained on data, and if that data is a skewed, biased representation of humanity, then it's going to behave in a skewed, biased way. So the answer is yes, we would need to give it a much better, diverse view of humanity for it to be able to represent humanity. Again, once it becomes a super intelligence, I think all bets are off. We have no idea what happens beyond that. But if we're building AIs on the data that I've just mentioned, we'll see it behave like the negative parts of humanity. We just have to, again, it goes back to being a safety problem. Make sure that we're training on data that's representative of how we want it to behave.
Yeah. Do you think responsibility is on the individual as well to, I guess, filter what they say on social media, to not be so negative and to not be pointing fingers and to not be fighting so much online?
I think it's a responsibility of individuals, of companies, of governments. I think that there's a position to play with all of them. You know, there are some people that are mentally ill that have access to Twitter, and in which case there's not anything that you can tell them that will maybe necessarily change their behavior. So that's where governments step in, and we have police, and there are biases and groupthink and things like that, and that's where companies can step in and try to mitigate some of those risks. There is but I do think that we'll get the most benefit by educating individuals and trying to uplift the consciousness of all of humanity, because it's really, even in companies and even in governments, it's still run by individuals. So I think I used to do a martial art that was actually a Zen Buddhist discipline in Japan, and I won't give you the whole backstory, but the kind of founder of that martial art had a phrase which was the person, everything depends on the quality of the person, and he realized that rebuilding Japan after the First World War didn't depend on governments and corporates. It depended on educating as many individuals as possible to make good decisions, and I really align with that.
Yeah, really interesting. It's a philosophical debate which you can go down for a rabbit hole for hours on end. I'm conscious of your time, Daniel, so I'll ask you one more question. With singularities, let's say 30, 40, 50 years out, are you optimistic that it's going to be that's going to work out for us, it'll be a great opportunity? Or are you more pessimistic that we're going to balls it up and it's going to be a threat?
I'm an optimist. I think that we have an absolute chance to make a glorious future. I am also a realist, and I'm trying to hedge myself. You know, what happens if things go wrong, and how can I protect myself, my family, my friends from any fallout? And but if I wasn't an optimist, I wouldn't be here doing these podcasts. I would be using my time to go and protect myself from an inevitably awful future. But what I want to do is use my voice and my platform to kind of educate and inspire as many people as possible to make good decisions, because it's within all of our gift to make that future. It's not governments, it's not companies. We have the ability to hold governments, to hold companies to account by what we pay for, what we vote, and it's all down to us as individuals. And I am hopeful that collectively we'll ultimately make very good decisions.
That's a great answer. Daniel, thank you so much for coming on today. You have an amazing ability to break down something that's extremely complicated, one of the most complicated issues facing us in the next couple of decades, and making it very digestible for people like me. I mean, I'm only 23. I know nothing about AI, but yeah, you've increased my understanding. And yeah, really important topic actually to talk about. So thank you for coming on tonight.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, Sam.
For anyone listening, I'm going to leave a link in the description below to Daniel's TED Talk. I thoroughly recommend everyone goes to watch it, because we only touched on elements of a PESTEL, but he goes into depth and breaks it down to, as I said, really digestible pieces of information. So if you enjoyed today's episode, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.